Good afternoon. I'm going to wear a couple of hats today. I am the executive director of ShareSpace, but I also am the Washington rep of Buzz Aldrin's StarCraft Booster, which, as I know you guys have probably heard Buzz speak yesterday, you might have mentioned it. That is a particular design solution for what we think we ought to be doing in terms of space architecture, to do the kind of things we think we ought to be doing, which is design and develop an open-ended architecture that will lead to going back to the moon, going on Mars, and use tourism, high-volume tourism, thousands, tens of thousands of people in orbit. Use that as a stepping stone to develop the infrastructure to do what we want to do. It's all part of an integrated strategy. Right now, NASA has not addressed. Towards the end of the talk, I will throw up some slides on our particular design solution. People get really concerned when we start talking about a specific design solution for something. It isn't the solution as much as it is the approach that I'll be talking about for how we get to where we are today. As a country, we put a lot of effort in the near term and recently in single-stage orbit, both in the commercial sector and NASA. And that particular single-stage orbit approach is not panning out like we all envisioned 5 years ago. There are other approaches to reusable launch vehicles. And what I'll be talking about a little bit here is a different approach. It uses something that we call the 2 stages. This we know we can do.
I was working for SSI at one point.
But this is about tourism. How are we going to get those thousands of people into space? And can this tourism community that's out there, the travel and tourism, will help support us do that? Is there really an avenue, a way to tap into this existing industry, maybe draw upon some of those resources to help us in our efforts? I mean, this is an incredible industry. It's the 3rd largest sector of the United States economy right now. It generates over $80 billion in revenue. It employs 16.2 million workers in the United States alone. 10% of the global workforce, travel and tourism, is responsible for. This is a huge amount. It's like 260 million plus people. So this is a big industry. It's expanding very quickly. Over 100 million new jobs are expected between now and 2007. And it's bigger than it's already twice as big. It's double the world military spending, which is spent on travel and tourism, and all the world's armies spend on their rockets and bombs. So it's a pretty big number. Generally 11% of the gross domestic product, global gross domestic product. That's something like in excess of $3 trillion. So it's big. Combined travel and tourism, the world's largest industry. How do we tap into that? That's much bigger than aerospace. And one of the neatest sections of travel and tourism is adventure travel and tourism. It's booming right now. It in itself is generating over $5 billion in revenues yearly. And I'm sure you've heard of companies like Space Adventures now, where you can buy packages to do exciting things that are space-related. But before Space Adventures was there, there have been a number of adventure packages that take people into the heart of Africa, down to the South Pole, up to the North Pole, down to see the Titanic. And all these things are very expensive. If you're going to go to the North Pole right now, you're going to spend $30,000 to $40,000. Certainly, Buzz and I had the great opportunity to do not too long back. South Pole is going to cost you significantly more, maybe $60,000 to $70,000 if you want to climb Mount Everest. Mount Everest is amazing. Right now, it's running about $100,000. People are paying $100,000 a piece to go, climb Mount Everest. 600 people have made it. Out of 35,000 people have tried, 600 people have made it so far. And 140 people have died. And if you look at that death rate, that's about the same as, that's about 99.6%. If we can get our reusable launch vehicles up, to that kind of reliability, step forward. People are willing to put big money into those kind of exotic destinations, knowing that there's a reasonably good chance, or at least a small chance, that they're not going to survive. Anyway, this market has grown. The wealthy people in the world are getting wealthier and more of them. They have more money to spend on these exotic adventures. And space is the next logical evolution of this adventure tourism segment. And one of the problems is we don't understand the market quite well enough yet. We're still, we know there's a big market out there. NASA and the Space Transportation Association have just recently published a couple of studies on this space tourism market. We know there are millions of people that would be willing to spend a considerable amount of their yearly income to go to space. But we don't really have that market bounded that well. We don't know by age groups exactly how much. There's a lot we don't understand, which has got to be a major near-term focus of our activities, and I'll touch upon that in a sec. But the big problem in this country right now is space launch. Everybody here is aware of this. I mean, this is not new to anybody in this organization. But it's getting to the point now where our space launch infrastructure is actually an embarrassment. We haven't seen any innovation in our space architecture for years, not since the space shuttle came about many years ago. We're still basically totally dependent on expendable launch vehicles. Now, yes, we have this new evolved expendable launch vehicle, but that's nothing more than the same thing we've had for the last 40 years. They put a nice new chrome plating on the engine nozzles, and it's the same thing. They save and revamp some of their ground systems, but basically we're still, with every payload we put in orbit, we're still dumping the stages of that rocket in the drink, and we're still throwing away the rocket with every single launch. That's just no way to run a rocket business. Single station orbit, we put a big emphasis on that in this country the last 5 years. 5 years ago, if you recall, 5 years ago, there was this dawn on us that, geez, NASA hasn't put any money into advanced propulsion systems in 25 years. Literally, after Apollo, we dropped the ball with the rocket engine development. So finally, it was 5 years ago when we started this whole single stage orbit thing on the hill, it was a smart thing to do, because we've done nothing for 25 years. And single stage orbit definitely pushes the technology envelope. And we had to do it. Well, now 5 years into it, we can see that, at least in the government effort, we probably chose a path that was technologically more challenging than we thought. We're having problems with the engines. We're having problems with destruction. We're not quite there. It's still another 10 years away, maybe. So where does that leave us? We have NASA focusing on single stage high technology. We have the Air Force doing evolved expendable launch vehicle. Well, that's now about to fly. But you take this high-tech approach out of it, and it leaves us exactly where we were 20 years, 30 years ago, which is not where we want to be. I was thinking, this is why we've been having these conferences now for 19 years. I probably did a dozen of them, maybe more. I gave my first talk 12 or 13 years ago on the same topic, talking about this same thing. And what's happened? Nothing. Really nothing. We made no progress. We'll touch upon that towards the end. And we do have a lot more entrepreneurs involved, which is really great. We have had some representation on the Hill. They have been effective in leveraging leveling the playing field for the entrepreneurs. That's fine. It's really great that we have a lot of these small little launch companies out there that are trying to make a difference. But the bottom line is that the small companies, even if one of them succeeds, they won't have any impact for a decade, maybe, on the existing launch manifest. Those small companies put up really small payloads, and none of them have any real evolutionary growth. They're pretty much evolutionary dead ends. They're reaching for these small niche markets, which is fine. Make money here. But how is that going to get us to space tourism? How is that going to get lots of people in space? How is that going to get us back to the moon and on to Mars? And the answer is it's not. There is no integrated approach to develop architecture that can grow in a logical fashion that will get us to where we want to go. So, I don't want to say anything bad about the entrepreneur stuff. I think it's all great. But it's not going to happen if we, all of us want to build space colonies that see moon bases and Mars bases. And putting a lot of emphasis in the commercial world right now is really a bit of a diversion that this group ought to seriously think about. And entrepreneurs got their own problems. Their market's evaporating, and so we're going to be rethinking a lot of those efforts anyway. And perhaps most distressing is the big manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. Do you understand that by awarding both of them winners of the ELV market, that just erased any incentive for either of those companies to compete for lower launch costs, to evolve their existing extendable architecture in any way that would make some sense to help incrementally lower launch costs. And they have absolutely no incentive to develop a reusable launch vehicle. They talk a good line. Lockheed Martin will suck up every single federal dollar available to keep studying and keep working on X-33. And they'll study this, until we're all dead. But they don't want to make it happen because they've got the market cornered on highly lucrative, totally expendable launch vehicles. It's the thought that they are, helping the situation out is just plain wrong. Anybody that thinks that Lockheed Martin and Boeing wants to help build an X-33 or a Venture Star or a reusable launch vehicle, forget it. They are the enemy. NASA is the enemy. NASA, those Huntsville studies that are going on right now at Marshall Space Flight Center, those are designed by the architectures they're looking at to keep Lockheed Martin and Boeing in business for the next 10 or 20 years with their throwaway rockets. That's just the way it is. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of awareness of this situation by folks that ought to be somewhat concerned about this. They are the enemy, and at the end we can talk about maybe a way to change that. Anyway, and making things even worse, we've got NASA that's still pushing for order of magnitude drop in launch costs. And they're maintaining that by looking at whenever they have these architecture studies, which have been going on now for a couple of years. These are just the recent architecture studies. We've been studying space architectures for since day one. I mean, there are somewhere in some room in NASA there's probably an entire room full of old architecture studies. These guys know how to build rockets and know all the different ways to evolve things. But right now NASA is pretty much, I don't want to say bought and paid for, but they're certainly in bed with Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and they're certainly not doing anything to upset the apple cart for Lockheed Martin and Boeing right now. I wish it were true. So anyway, the problem is when we're looking at a launch, we're trying to design an architecture around a model where we're only launching maybe 1,000 satellites over a 10-year period. That's a very low lightweight traffic load. And you just don't need much more than expendable rockets to keep that going, right? Now, it's only when we start looking at something that's going to really radically change that mission like tourism, where we might want to have 10, 20, 30, 40,000 tourists, each one being a payload. That'll force them into an entirely different direction, a direction that they're not really willing to go into right now, unfortunately. Maybe we can help influence them in the near future. Also, another thing that's going to help influence them is we now have a lot of very stiff competition from the Europeans. The Ariane 5 is now one of two very successful launches. They're ready to, they're going after this big new 6-ton geosynchronous satellite market. They're going to take it from us. Just like they said they were going to do with Ariane 2 and 3 and 4, where they took away the bulk of the commercial market. They're saying they're going to take the existing geosync market from us, and they're going to do it. And the thing is, who out there cares? I don't hear anybody at NASA. I hear Dan Golden when he's talking in front of Congress. I don't even hear him saying, well, I'm a little worried about the success that Arians have, and we know they can launch cheaper than we can. They've got a launch site that's closer to the equator than we do. They got, it's a modern launch site. These guys got their act together. I don't hear them worried about that, though. I don't hear anybody in the government worried about the fact that Lockheed Martin, through their ILS, is falling in love with the Russians, and they're developing a new reusable launch system that's going to be very much like what I'm showing you in a minute, which basically takes the first stage of a rocket, puts wings on it, brings it back, and flies it over and over and over again. And we now have studies that say by using that approach, we can cut launch costs in half a grade. We know we can do this. But NASA is still hung up on order of magnitude. It's not a factor of 10. They don't want to hear about it. Because Lockheed Martin doesn't want to hear about it. And Boeing doesn't want to hear about it. They want to just plug along with the new. So all that kind of leads to the fact that there's all this stuff going on in the space activist community, which is us here. We've been pretty nebulous and diffuse in our efforts in the last years. Although maybe 5 years ago, I think it was probably pretty smart to put some effort in single stage of orbit. We had to get off top dead center. The fact is that isn't succeeding. It's not going to fly. Metrostar is never going to fly. We ought to be looking at ways now to tell NASA to go in other directions, other approaches to help do the kind of things we want to do. We've been very, I don't want to say misled or misguided, but I think it's time to reevaluate the whole space program. We got a new administration, new millennium. We had some fairly obvious failures. Maybe it's time to rethink things out. We've definitely been diverted by the promise of immature technology and commercial enterprise, and we've abandoned those approaches that can get us to the launch agreements. And I think we got to get back on track. So where does that leave us? Where it leaves us is we're locked into the same architecture we've had for over 30 years. And for some reason, everything still keeps getting even more expensive than 30 years ago. I can't really explain that. So what can we possibly do? We've got to drastically change the game plan. That's what we've got to do. There is a way. The question, is there a way to break out of the high-cost, low-flight rate paradigm? Yes, there is. It's called there is a high-volume space tourism traffic model. That's the key. But its commercial needs must be given prime importance when defining the requirements for the next generation launch vehicle. I just had a talk with Cummins and after he doesn't want to hear me talk about Shuttle 2 or whatever's going to replace the shuttle. I don't care what you call it. We need something to replace that shuttle. It's way too expensive. And we need something probably that will be what it was originally intended to be, which was a two-stage system. And I don't care what you call it, but whatever it does, if we let NASA and the Department of Defense define the requirements for us, we're going to get a vehicle that we're not going to want. It isn't going to help us do the kind of thing we want to do. What we ought to be very vocal and active in the near future is getting involved in defining those requirements from a commercial perspective. If by some chance we can, if we really want to see 30, 40, 50,000 people flying in space in a year with much more reliable, lower cost systems, then we have to let NASA and DOD know and be involved in that decision process. And then I don't think we can mind what we call the shuttle fuel or whatever, as long as the commercial sector is involved. So, but it's time now to start making those kind of decisions, and it's time for us to get introspective again. We've been down, here I am, this is, we've been talking these same issues now for almost 20 years. Not much has changed. We kind of got involved, we recognized the importance of cheap access to space, probably, 8, 10 years back, and that's a good approach. We decided to kind of agree with NASA that the way the route to get there, the approach, was single-stage orbit. And we've been down that road now for 5 years. NASA and Lockheed Martin are not succeeding. Rotary rocket has its problems for different reasons, but it doesn't make any difference what reason that we fail. The bottom line is we're as far away from a low-cost, reusable launch vehicle now as we were 10 or 20 years ago. So we have some big decisions to make. And I guess the first question we have to ask, with what we know today, what should be the objective in space transportation for the next decade? We really have to think about that. Because if it's just launching cheaply, if it's pure, cheap access to space, that drives us in one direction. If the answer is having affordable launches, and affordable habitats, and tourism, and affordable moon Mars trips, well, that drives us in an entirely different direction. And maybe this wasn't clear to us 4 or 5 years ago. It's very clear now. So if we decide to keep supporting NASA, keep supporting X-33, and that whole approach, basically, we're in for another decade of frustration. Now, if we decide that to do what we know we can't do, if single-stage warming is so darn hard, we know we can do it in 2 stages. And if we look at logical evolutionary paths to getting people up there in 2 stages, this opens up entire new architectural development path options that NASA has not looked at. And we've been bugging them. We've been to Huntsville. We tried to get Art Stevenson and his gang to look at these, where a high-volume tourism model would look. And he told us, hey, we don't have anything to do with the shuttle, for one. He's the head of space transportation. They don't want to have anything to do with the shuttle, evolving it in the direction that can help us in the future. All they care about is pie in the sky, 30-year horizon projects, magnetic levitation, all kinds of weird things out. And they can help us in the near term at all. At all. And he's getting his direction from Dan Boeing and headquarters. And the bottom line is if we listen to these guys much longer and let them define the path, we're not going to go anywhere in our lifetime. So we'll never see, never get back to the moon, forget ever going to Mars. I mean, Mars is really what it's all about. I work for this guy, Buzz Aldrin. His whole life is getting people to Mars. That's what it's all about. But it's obvious. It's been obvious to him obvious to him for longer than for most of us. But the only way we're really going to do that is through the private sector, through the commercial sector right now. There will never be another big government program to do that. We have to do it. And the thing is, there's never going to be a private sector-driven Mars program as long as it costs so darn much to get there. As long as we're using the same old, very expensive launch vehicles. Well, how do you drive down the cost of these launch vehicles? Well, that's where tourism comes in. That's why tourism is everything we're doing now. We're looking at tourism as the catalyst to use those economies of scale to drive down launch costs. So that's what I'm touching upon. Next slide. I do?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, what time did I start?
25 after.
Okay. All right, well, space tourism can be the lever to change things. If we look at high volume, tens of thousands of people as a mission model, and you look at that kind of a model, and where's that drive you? Well, it drives you towards reusability and away from expendability. So it's going to get out as expendable launch vehicles. And if we're going to bring costs down, you got to start reusing the launch vehicles. It drives us toward 2 stages. We can't do 1 stage, we know it. It drives us, we know we can do 2 stages already, so it drives us in that direction, away from single stage. It drives us towards kerosene fuel in the first stage, and away from liquid hydrogen in the first stage for cost and safety reasons. It drives us towards generous design margins for high reliability, and away from thin margins for high performance. And so it drives us in very definitive directions, different from what we're looking at today. And there are many clear evolutionary paths when you go into these directions. And these paths that come from a tourism type mission model, they will enable and will allow us to do everything that we want to do. To go back to the moon, to go on to Mars, to put tens of thousands of people people in space a year and build space hotels and do lunar tourism. You go down this path by building the right kind of elements that allow you to develop a family and vehicles to do these things, we can get there. But until we get going down the right path, we're going nowhere. Space tourism will cause a shift. It will force NASA and industry to adjust high flight rate mission models, which they don't want to do because they're seeing that doesn't happen right now with their expanding launch vehicles. And Lockheed and Boeing don't ever want to change, despite what they say. They both have vice presidents in charge of reusable launch vehicles. They talk a good talk, like they want to really support the development of these things. But the bottom line is they are there to make sure those reusable launch vehicles get pushed off to the last possible date. And that date is going to be when people in this room and when Congress forces them to change. Moves us towards things that we can do. We know how to do two-stage storage. We have all that technology here. That's one of the reasons that NASA uses to not do it, is because they want to push the leading edge. You know, two-stage is not leading edge. It's here today. Anyway, getting back to this idea of the market that must be bounded, one of the big things that we've been doing in the share space is we've been out trying to redirect about $3.5 million of NASA's precious funds to do the type of architecture study that needs to be done. We've been teaming up with different organizations, USRA, Space Transportation Association, and a few others, looking at ways to do a study very similar to the National Commission on Space Study many years back, but focused on defining this new vision that will be based on alternative architecture in Huntsville, Mississippi. We have spent a lot of time on it. We actually started this 2 years ago, and last year we didn't succeed. This year we got involved early, and we found a good friend in the name of a guy named Trent Lott, who was the top Senate guy. The majority whip. He has told us how we're going to make this happen. So, I think we're looking pretty good for getting $3.5 million directed from somewhere in NASA to do the kind of study that we really need to do, put some meat on the bones of it, to define this vision that we want to do, integrate this vision of lunar and Mars and space colonies and everything, and to come up with the correct architecture to make that happen. We don't have that vision, and we have some papers that are written, but nothing in a little book that haven't done a serious analysis. That they do at places like Huntsville and Langley, and they look at different vehicles and see how they should grow to satisfy certain requirements. We need to do that. We're not getting help from NASA. That's going to have to be help from the private sector. We're going to need your help. I've got some stuff up here. I got about 10 copies of this paper. There's a bunch of copies on one page. All the names of guys in the Senate and House Appropriations Committee, all of whom we've talked to, we massaged this thing pretty well, but they're going to go to a conference on this in mid-June. They're going to talk about how they're going to divvy up all the money. I think, we're setting together. We can certainly use any help. Any telephone calls or faxes to those offices saying we support what Buzz Aldrin's doing related to developing an alternative space architecture would be greatly appreciated. See, the next slide, I think, is pretty much talking about what I was talking about. What are we going to do with the newspaper, with the space architecture study? Well, we need something that definitely will tell us if passenger travel can provide the market that we need to lower space costs. We strongly suspect that it can, but it does need some more analysis. And we also need to understand the impact of flight rate on costs. We think we know. Aerospace Corporation has done some pretty incredible work in this area, and Jay Penn, does some great stuff. But all that needs to be looked at and verified and expanded upon. So that needs to be done. We want to employ professional market research organizations to try to get a handle on the market. We want to involve all the entrepreneurial companies to see how their particular approaches to an evolutionary architecture to satisfy these kind of high emission volume, high traffic volume traffic volumes. If they can't, then they don't work in our plan. If they can, great. We also have a ring. We also want to know how these little guys can all satisfy these other broader water targets that we have to go back to the moon, to go to Mars, and maybe build solar power satellites. Will those systems evolve, bring costs down low enough to enable some of those kind of projects? If they don't, well, we need to understand that so we can better focus on our activities. All right. I'll wrap it up by this. The way to do this, there's only one rational way to do this from where we are today, and that's through this reusable first stage. Boeing's got a reusable first stage, Lockheed Martin's got a reusable first stage, Reusable often has a different approach. And the thing is by going through this approach, from a two-stage reorbit system, it enables a lot of these things that to happen that we want to get to. We need the National Space Society to put some focus on NASA to look at that particular approach, reusable first stage, as opposed to purely a single-stage orbit approach. And there are many different ways to get there. A logical path is to put these things to a growth version to be made into the shuttle in its last years of life, to prove out the vehicle, make the shuttle a little bit more cost-effective, and use that liquid fly, they call it liquid flyback booster, use that as the key element of the next generation, of the next vehicle that was fit on that to take people to space. We've got that architecture pretty well figured out. We don't want to waste, and here's that's a good picture of, and that's on the NASA website, by the way, that's surprising to find this. NASA has done something about this. We want to look at that lower, that commercial generated approach. We want to use the private sector, all those commercial satellites that are out there, prove out these reusable first stages, then grow into something that's maybe shuttle size, and then maybe with a new orbiter to replace the shuttle. We can do all this in 12 years. We got to get started down that path. I don't need to go down this particular design solution. Buzz's got an approach. It's its own unique path. But this design solution isn't significant. What's significant is the approach. Usable first stage. I don't care if you want to call it something like that. I don't care what you call it. But we need to get down that path. Because once we use that to develop that building block element, we can put this thing together in different ways. There are hotels in orbit and using external tanks and putting hotels on the moon. Which is great. But we don't have a way to get there. We're far away from the earth we were 10 centuries ago. So we develop this architecture that can get us to those hotels. The external tank, years ago, I used to I swear down. Everything we're learning right now about the International Space Station is telling us it's the wrong way to go. You never want to build a space station that way. Now we're looking at like 45 to 70 flights to build this thing up. I think it's 45 shuttles, something like that. $500 million a piece. Put it there, little tank toys. This is ridiculous. It was the only fundable way to do it. Skylab, one launch. That was the way to do it. That's the way the commercial sector, that's the way it goes. Like a Skylab approach. But we need that architecture. We need an architecture for a reusable first stage. You can bang those elements with reusable elements around an ET core, put your hotel up on top, and then launch it in one launch. All right, now before we do that, we will launch 10 or 20,000 tourists up there. We will prove the market out that there is indeed a market for people that want to go up to space. But until we get going on this track, this is the only foreseeable, logical, evolutionary track to get us there. And until we get started, it's just all mental masturbation.
One more question. Yeah, you seem to assume that the problem with the NASA Lockheed Martin X-33 Venture Star project is the configuration SSTO and not the organization's NASA Lockheed Martin. If it turns out to be the organizations that are the problem, what are the implications of that for your plans that we're working through NASA?
The problem is technology. I don't care who builds it. Maybe OSC is the answer. OSC is a much smaller, non-bureaucratic approach.
Look at where X-34 is at this point.
What?
Sorry, cheap shot. No, have you looked at where X-34 is at this point?
You're right. I agree absolutely. Well, I definitely think that may be wrong, but I think the problem is more the technology, putting together there the organization that's doing it, but I may be wrong.
I'm of the opinion that the primary problem there is the organization, that any number of configurations can be made to work if the right organization get resources.
Well, I mean, but we haven't yet started down this logical approach to something we can do. Right now, we're going down, we're developing technology that doesn't exist, and it's taken longer to get there than we thought, and it just ain't going to happen in our lifetime. But maybe somebody's really done guys down there, maybe, but
I agree with you on that. One of the interesting view graphs I've seen recently was NASA's plan for the future. It culminates with a frame titled 2040, and it shows the space cruiser out of 2001 approaching the space station. So NASA's plan for the future is to get us to 2001 and 2040.
right. Okay,